Hey everyone, we're back for another author interview with Jonathan Downie, author of the book Multilingual Church. And Jonathan, I'm glad you're able to make the time and for this conversation. Would you introduce yourself to people out there?
Yeah, I'm Jonathan Downie. Those who want to be polite to me nowadays call me Dr. Downie. I'm a consultant church interpreter specializing in helping churches and Christian organizations become multilingual and respond to the challenges of being in our increasingly multilingual communities and world.
So the book is called Multilingual Church, and I think we just agreed on the subtitle, right?
Yes,
What? Yeah, I just got it. I just got it sent to me. Do you remember what it is?
the
It's so
the
fresh.
the subtitle is Strategies for Making Disciples in All Languages.
That's it. Okay, because there were a few close ones we were looking at. So I love that. I was a fan of that one. And so tell us what is the central message of the book?
The central message of the book is that multilingual church is actually God's idea. It's not a good idea. It's not a marketing idea. It's God's idea. And there are proven, known strategies that can help you do it. I really wanted to get across to people that this isn't something that people are making up. This isn't something that people are inventing. This is something that's in the Bible. This is something that's in the mission of God. And this is something that is practically applicable to your church now.
Hmm. Now it's interesting that you would, say, it's not something we invented. It's in the Bible. And in my mind, I'm like, well, of course it is. And so, it's basically, well, yeah, who would doubt that? But I certainly you have come across people who challenge you on that. So who is the book written for then?
So the book is really written for church leaders. I guess there would be a theological work at some point, but I was really aiming this book at church leaders of any kind, whether you're children's work leaders or youth leaders or senior pastors or international ministry leaders. Any church leader who's looking at doing multilingual church or multilingual ministry, or even who are wanting to increase the effectiveness of the work they're already doing. I've come across some multilingual churches who are asking questions about equipment, or they're asking questions about strategy, or I was coming across one recently about asking about the volunteer and the time costs of adding another language when they're already bilingual. So leaders who are thinking through these kind of questions, that's who I'm looking to aim the book at.
Okay. So, what inspired you to write this book? And maybe in the process, explain what you mean by multilingual church, because some people may not be accustomed to that term.
So let's start with multilingual church. Multilingual church for me doesn't mean that you can see a sign somewhere that says welcome in 20 languages. Multilingual
Okay.
church for me means that being multilingual is all through the identity, the activities, and the ministry of the church.
Mm,
It's who the church is, not what the church does.
mm,
And so it means that you can walk into the church and you can hear your language spoken from the front. You can hear it in home groups. There's materials available in your language. So you don't need to speak what I call the locally dominant language to feel at home and to be discipled in that church. That's what multilingual church is for me. I know that goes a lot further than most other authors who've talked about multi-ethnic church, which is a sister concept, or multicultural church or intercultural church. I'm really wanting to push on our thinking that it's not about having a sign or having interpreting on stage. It's about changing the fundamental identity and the way the church works. And the reason why I wrote it, there's an old movie called Robots. It's an animated movie for kids. And the main character has this phrase. He says, see a need, fill a need. It's a character called Big
mm,
World.
mm.
And I noticed two things. One, I noticed that there was a lot of knowledge about church interpreting that was growing, especially over the past couple of years since we've had the bibliography of interpreting in Christian settings. I started my PhD in 2010, where there weren't a lot of resources available. There's a huge amount. I think we're up to about 91 individual entries in the bibliography now, including books and dissertations and theses. So there's a lot of information out there, but precisely none of it was getting to churches.
Mm.
And I was frustrated about that. I'm trained as an interpreter. I've done some work as a commercial consultant interpreter. And about 2 years ago, after a mental health issue, I felt God calling me out of emphasizing commercial work and into throwing everything into church interpreting. And so part of what drove the book is my journey over the past 2 years, because I didn't even know if any paid work existed in church interpreting anywhere in the world. And part of this is, in a sense, my thank you for the journey over the past 2 years, but also my awareness of the issues that I've come across in the past 2 years in the persistent approaches and attitudes that I've come across, and some I didn't expect, some I did.
Hmm.
And this is my response, if you like, to what I've discovered over the past 2 years.
Okay, so let me anticipate possibly a few responses because some people may hear you and say, uh, what are you talking about? I mean, we have a lot of churches have Sunday services with different languages, maybe different, a service for people who speak Spanish, people who speak
Mm.
whatever else. I mean, isn't that what we're doing? I mean, isn't that a solution that's pretty popular?
It's a very popular solution, especially in the US, and I would say amongst some of the smaller churches are doing that as well. But we now know from research that in the long term that doesn't work. It tends to create a new church rather than one multilingual church. So even in books that aren't even about church interpreting, you'll find stories of, oh, the Spanish congregation wandered off and became their own church. Also, it tends to isolate people into their own individual groups. So you have the Spanish group, the English group, the French group, whatever, and they never meet each other. They don't know each other. The question that I would ask churches doing it that way is, in what sense are these all services that are part of the same church?
Hmm.
And in what sense has the idea of being multilingual or multicultural, whichever word you want to use, in what sense has that changed the church? I think that solution is easy. That solution doesn't really cost anything apart from space, and so it's attractive. But precisely because it doesn't cost anything, it doesn't embed multilingualism. It doesn't embed the kind of Revelation 7, I think it is, where you have people praising God from every language and nation and tribe. It doesn't embed that in the life of the church. It delegates it to someone else. And to me, that's missing out on the fullness of what God can actually do through the church and what God is calling us to say to the society around us as well.
Okay. Well, let's go. Let me play hardball with another possible response I could hear. I've heard many people say, well, if you come to a country, learn the local language. So if you're in France, people should learn French. If you're in the UK or the United States, you should learn English.
Mm.
So what's wrong with expecting people to learn the local language and then let that overcome these, challenges you're talking about?
So the nice response is I've been speaking French since about the age of 8. I can write in French, although formal French I still have to play with a little bit. I've got 2 degrees in French. And still, if you want to affect my heart, you speak to me in English. If
Hmm.
you want my brain to take in, I regularly listen to the Bible in French, but it doesn't have nearly the oomph factor in my heart that hearing in the language that I grew up speaking has. The second side of that is that I would ask, what are we saying to other people when we say to them, if you want to fully take part in the church, you have to learn our language? We're then recapitulating or repeating the power structures and the views of integration that the world around us has. Whereas in Acts 2, God shows us a different model. There was Aramaic, which was the language of trade. There was Greek, which was the language of learning and the language of empire. And if you look in the languages spoken in Acts 2, Aramaic isn't there. Greek
Hmm.
is one of several languages there. And so God's priority was always, I'm going to lay myself down so that people can hear this in their language. I'm going to go the extra mile. Pentecost wasn't necessary linguistically, but God did it anyway.
Hmm.
And so, if that's the model that God's starting the church with, the church that was born in a blaze of multilingual glory might just be being called to live in a blaze of multilingual glory as well. And there's nothing wrong with having language classes, there's nothing wrong with helping people get used to the world around them.
Hmm.
But there is something wrong when language competence becomes a limit on how people can serve in the church. That's
Hmm.
when I believe we've not only let ourselves down, we've missed the heart of the gospel.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Okay. So this raises all kinds of questions and curiosities because on the one hand, we can say, hey, Holy Spirit, can you do that again, like every day and every week, around 11 o'clock when our service ends, or starts, but on the other hand, can go AI. It's like, hey, is this guy saying that we need to have AI chips put in our brain so that we can hear everything? So what would you suggest to a church do if they want to use several languages in their Sunday service and still use interpreting? And how would this work?
So I wouldn't recommend machine interpreting for sermons. Theologically, that's dodgy anyway. Can a computer preach? That's a whole other, someone else can write that book one day. But There are drawbacks from in machine interpreting that are in my previous book and in this book as well. But also fundamentally, we know with machine interpreting, we're giving people second best. So it's like we're eating all the best bread and throwing the crumbs to the people who need it. So I don't think
Mm,
that's a long-term answer. I would say the number one answer is find an expert, buy the book, find an expert who can walk you through. But also, one of the things that I say in the book is there are no perfect solutions.
mm,
Start with the vision of your church. Start with what this is for and who this is for. Are you really saying this is just for the people who need these other languages? Or is this so that the whole church can grow together? What does your church budget look like? What do your church resources look like? How ready are the congregation for discomfort? And walk through the process of looking through the possible solutions. I give lots of things that churches can do in the book. And rather than saying this is the perfect one, this is the better one, I say
mm.
here are different ways of doing it. So if you need lots of languages with interpreting, I would suggest that churches invest in a Zoom Pro license. Zoom Pro has an interpreting module built in that people can use, and then chat to someone who knows about interpreting and ask them to introduce you to the wonderful world of what's called relay interpreting.
Huh.
I wouldn't recommend that people who aren't professionally trained do too much relay interpreting because it's a lot harder than normal interpreting, but there are ways around things. And I had someone recently saying, "Oh, we didn't know where to find an interpreter in such and such a language." And my answer was, I probably have one on my phone. So someone who
Oh,
knows
wow.
church interpreting, someone who knows interpreting at all, can almost certainly sort you out. In most countries, we'll have a professional association who you can email and say, "We're trying to do this, we don't know how to." But a consultant church interpreter will give you the best advice.
Oh my, you jumped into the deep end. I mean, immediately talking to some like a variety of ideas here and probably some things that people didn't even know existed, like some of the
Yes.
technology you mentioned for sure. And I laugh because this you're not taking a very Western approach where it's a one size fits all, you know.
So I've qualified as a professional interpreter about 15 years ago. And if there's a way to do interpreting well, I've done it. If there's a way to do interpreting badly, I've also done that. So I've literally done the whole lot. There's not much in terms of one way interpreting. So in conference settings that I haven't seen. And I realized very quickly that while there are guides that professional conference interpreters will say you should do it this way, you should do it that way, churches are a strange bunch.
Hmm.
And there are solutions that churches are comfortable using, and I'm comfortable with them using, that I would never suggest a commercial client use.
Could you say
Just
a little bit more? Because people would be curious, what's so strange about a church and interpreting?
so the first thing is churches, I have to be careful because I have data in my back pocket on this. Churches, as a rule, tend to want personal commitment to Christianity.
Mm,
There are reasons why some don't. That's a whole other thing. But churches, as a rule, tend to want that. They also tend to be outside of the mega churches, they tend to be very cash poor.
mm,
So while I would never ever say to a commercial company to consider volunteer interpreters to a church because of the very specific requirements on church interpreters, I would say that is something you should consider as long as you're prepared to invest in training and so long as you're prepared to invest in ongoing pastoral support.
mm.
As soon as a church does a series on abuse or has testimonies of people who've come out of traumatic circumstances, which is normal fare in certain churches, your interpreter is reliving that as they're interpreting it.
Mm,
You need to make sure they have access to pastoral support.
mm.
And I come down harder on churches than I do for commercial clients, because with a commercial client, I might interpret once, never see them again. They have no ongoing
Yeah,
support requirements for me. If
yeah,
you've got people working week by week in your church, you should be giving them the same level of pastoral support as your preaching and teaching team. They
yeah,
absolutely need it.
yeah, yeah. No, that's a good word. You know, I want to go back to something you said earlier, kind of in passing. I think you said, unless I misheard you, is you said this process of interpreting of being a multilingual church is not merely about reaching or serving those people of other languages,
Mhm.
but it has a benefit to the majority population.
Yes.
Say more about that because most people will hear this and go, "Oh, that's a really nice way to reach out to them."
So it's the us them that I think multilingual church, true biblical multilingual church, asks us to break that down. There's a wonderful quote from Pastor Mario Van Schaff in the book where he says, we've gone past the paradigm of saying we need to help these poor internationals. And now we tell them we need you because without you, we cannot fulfill the international vision.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So when being a multilingual church becomes who the church is, the church ceases to exist unless it's multilingual. It loses its identity without being multilingual. And then you get to the point of, well, which voices do we need to hear that we're not going to hear if we assume that English is the dominant language? So then you start getting a church where you can walk in on a Sunday and you don't know what the dominant language is because you're going to hear everything. And again, if you're going to do that, I would highly suggest that you talk to an expert in multilingual worship or certainly in interpreting, because there are technical and attitude issues you have to deal with around that. But then you start saying, well, why not have the Koreans in our church preach? Why should we have a leadership team who only speak one language? That makes no sense if we're trying to reach our multilingual community. And the very fact of being multilingual changes who we are as a people. The early church in Antioch, if you look at their teaching team, had a multitude of backgrounds in the leadership team. Wow. And that's, I believe, where God's calling churches now is that if you're in a multilingual area, everything from your leadership to your ministry should tell people this gospel works for everyone and it's equal for everyone.
Yeah. So you see this movement in a lot of books these days about being multi-ethnic, being diverse. It seems like your book really adds that discussion about multi-ethnic churches.
Yes. And also, I want to challenge the assumption in multi-ethnic church from the very earliest works in the 90s with Manuel Ortiz that multi-ethnic churches are churches that have English but have people from different backgrounds.
Okay.
Now, there is still, it's not as common as it used to be, but in a good chunk of multi-ethnic church work, English is still the assumed language.
Okay.
And there's still a discussion as to, does multi-ethnic church mean that everyone is called to share one common identity that we predefine, or is everyone called to be who God has called them to be? And that becomes our collective identity. I would go for the second, that we're not saying to people, you have to become like us. We're not saying, we're giving you this interpreting so you can feel more at home in the church. No. We're providing this interpreting so all of us can become more like Christ together. And that is going to mean making changes. That's just how life is when you're following Christ.
So this could work in other contexts. So like if you are, say, there's a lot of Chinese in Malaysia or in Indonesia. So where maybe Malay is the common language. So the Chinese also, this could also work, you're saying, in that kind of context, not just we talk a lot about the West, but like some of these other contexts, this would still work there, you think?
Anywhere where there's an imbalance in language power, then yes. It's a different dynamic where you have, French in Canada or some of the South African national languages. It's different. But anywhere where churches are tempted to say, we have this locally dominant language and that's what we're going to speak, I want to challenge that and say, in some circumstances, that's perfectly correct. If you're in an area, I mentioned a church in the book where a church I went to in my teens where there weren't really speakers of any other languages in the whole town when I went to that church for most of the time. So, of course, a church like that is not going to be multilingual. But if you're in any decent-sized modern town or city, you've got multilingualism taking the bins out. You've got multilingualism going to the park. So it makes no kingdom sense for that to stop at the door of the church.
So why do you think this is just now being written? I mean, to some sense, what you're talking about is thousands of years and it's an old context, but at the same time, like there's a timeliness to this book.
I think there's two things going on. One, migration seems to be growing. Arguably, we have more migration now than we've ever had before. Certainly, if you ignore COVID. So migration is a fact and it's growing.
Yeah.
And it's starting to become a controversy in Christianity because there's no decided upon unified Christian response to that. And so how Christians respond to migration is both a practical issue, what do you do when someone Polish wants to come to your church? Whether we like it or not, it's a political issue. We're making a political statement by the languages we have in our church. But it's also a kingdom issue. It's about the nature of the gospel. It's about
Mm,
what do we really believe about what it means to follow Christ. And so the other reason why it's timely is we've had decades of discussion of multi-ethnic church in the US and UK, and there's still an assumption somewhere that it's about people becoming more like us.
mm,
And so I want to say, no, it's not. Multi-ethnic church should
yeah.
not be about building some church identity that everyone adheres to. The church already has an identity and it's in Christ, and that's the only one that matters.
So essentially, what you're saying is by not addressing this language issue, we're implicitly, subtly maintaining a rigid, certain type of ethnic cultural identity that we don't even realize because
Yes,
we're not dealing with language.
yes, and we're and where people have dealt with language in the past, they've done some really good stuff on the technicalities on, how do you translate your sermon, how do you translate the announcements. But I've read recent books that have come out saying, we don't want to challenge the dominance of English in the church.
Hmm.
And my question is, well, why not? Why shouldn't we? You know, the kingdom of God from the outset has been one that has challenged dominant power structures. It has done that from the very fact of the cross. Jesus is in trial before Pilate, who's a representative of Caesar. If you look carefully at what's going on, Jesus is showing that the entire assumption of the Roman Empire's power structure is wrong, and he's going to show that by dying and rising again. He's showing a new kind of
Hmm.
kingship. So why should we, as modern Christians, stop doing that just because we're having a dominant language suits us?
Well, you're putting in terms of like turn over tables, but even just at a level of empathy, I think about all the years I spent overseas, and I was always the lingual minority,
Yes.
always. And so, if you've been in that situation, all of a sudden you go, "Oh, hold on, who am I to say you must learn my language?" And I'm like, I certainly would have liked somebody to reach out to me.
And I've noticed such a difference. So I've traveled because of speaking and because of interpreting. And when I'm in a country where I don't speak the language, I have a sigh of relief when I find someone who speaks English or French.
Hmm.
And I now realize I get it and I understand it, but I now realize how much I'm assuming that where I go, everything will be okay because I'll find someone who speaks my language.
Yeah.
I remember once I was doing a project and I was the only person in the meeting who wasn't a user of British Sign Language, and I was the one who needed the interpreter.
Um,
And suddenly my perspective shifted completely, and I went, now I know what interpreters need to do because now I know what I missed.
hmm. Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah. Wow.
one of my suggestions, which I don't know how many churches have taken me up on, is if you're a multilingual church, just start with 1 week and ask someone in your church for whom English isn't their first language, ask them to preach in their first language and have the English speakers or the speakers of whatever your locally dominant language is, have them in the position of needing the whatever
Wow.
language provision you have. Flip the
Wow.
tables sometimes, let those who use the dominant language be the ones who need the service. I
Wow.
guarantee you they'll come away changed.
Wow, that's powerful. It really seems like your experience, like this is not just a theoretical pie in the sky type book. This seems like your background as an interpreter has really shaped the writing of this book.
Yes, so it really, on any chapter that talks about interpreting, is shaped by the stuff that I've met on my journey. So, really simple stories of one time I was asked to interpret remotely for a church, and some people got saved who spoke French. They had forgotten to bring in French Bibles and discipleship resources.
Mm-hmm.
The obvious thing to happen, no one's fault. I don't think they were expecting it to be quite that effective that week. But and I've seen a range of church meetings and events that went great, and others where whatever they were doing about languages was just not working.
Yeah.
And so, actually, in a sense, I've learned more from the stuff that went wrong, from the times when preachers have said stuff, and I've had to interpret it and go, "How on earth do I handle this when I've got like a 3 second delay?" I've learned more from that than I did from, here's a classroom, here's a textbook, read it.
Yeah, yeah,
So,
yeah.
as much as I can, my background shaped it, but also studying the stuff for the book shaped it. I came across the Greek words splachnidzomai, sorry, which is the Greek word for compassion, and it means guts or
Mm,
entrails. It was their word for compassion. And for me, I wanted to write the book. I didn't want to write the book as someone who just found a new species of butterfly and was describing it to people. I wanted to write it because I've been at the sharp end. I wanted to
mm,
write it so that people could feel what it was like to be at the sharp end,
yeah,
and they could get the idea of not just the book was written with guts, but they could get the idea of their need for guts and compassion.
yeah,
Compassion that hits you in the gut and you go, oof. I
yeah,
want to produce some oof moments, because for me, the oof moments, the ones where I've been uncomfortable or where I felt out of my depth or where I felt overwhelmed, that's when I'm learning. When I'm comfortable and I'm
yeah,
going, oh, here's another Sunday with my headset on,
yeah,
I'm providing, but I'm not learning anything much. It's when you go, poof, when
yeah,
you've almost been winded by what you're learning, you come away from that changed.
yeah. Now, I want to respect your time. We only have a few more minutes, but this is really groundbreaking. This stuff you're talking about in this book is it's really paving new ground. So I imagine there's some pretty difficult chapters to write to figure out how do I communicate to people who have not been immersed in my world. What was maybe your maybe most difficult chapter or two to write?
So I hate to say it, the chapter on demographics, because I like writing stories. I like writing ideas and ways forward, and trying to get my head around the demographics and make that tangible and understandable for people.
Hmm.
And so I ended up going back and telling stories. And I think I rewrote that chapter about 5 or 6 times, trying to get my head around turning numbers into reality.
Hmm.
And I think I ended up going, actually, people need to feel this before they read it. So if you're a numbers person, I'm sorry, I think it took out about 80% of the numbers that I found. But that was the hardest. But on the other hand, the chapter after that on theology was the only chapter where I basically sat down and just went, I think it's Bruce Almighty, where he goes, it just, apart from cross checking scripture references and making sure, you know, finding the right Bible translations that really got across what I was trying to say, that chapter was just me on the page. It was just
Yeah.
so if that chapter seems to go fast, it's because that's the shortened version of the conversation you will get if you meet me at a conference somewhere.
Yeah, no, I love that because you have so many stories, but then you have the demographics to show that you've done the work, legwork, but then you get the theological pieces. It's so well rounded. So let's uh let's wrap up with this. What's some advice you would give to leaders who are looking, at multilingual church? What would you say?
First, find an expert, but also I would say the resources are there. So if you look on the Inside Interpreting YouTube channel, I give you the lowdown on the main solutions that you can use and their pros and cons. That video is free. That's a much shorter version of chapter 12 of this book. Chapter 12 gives you way more detail than I get in the video. I would also say find other pastors and leaders who have been there first.
Sure.
Talk to them about their journey, ask them where they're failing as well as where they're succeeding. You're going to learn more from other people's failures than you do from their successes. And also look for things like churchinterpreting.com, definitely buy the book, and find the resources that are available. And if necessary, anyone I know who likes church interpreting, who's a researcher, who's a consultant, who's into this in any way, love getting people's questions. And my favorite questions are the ones that I can't answer instantly. If someone says, we need advice on interpreting equipment, I can give you the 10-minute lowdown on that, no problem. But if someone asks me a question that I need to go, I need to think about that, you're going to get me probably at my best, because I'll be searching too and I'll be finding out too, and we'll be learning together. But find
Yeah.
an expert, find someone
Hmm.
who's been there, use the resources that are there, definitely buy the book, but connect with people who are in this space. And anyone I know in this space really wants your questions,
Yeah.
because there are gaps in our knowledge that we just haven't filled yet.
Yeah. Okay. It's fantastic. So the book is called Multilingual Church: Strategies for Making Disciples in All Languages.
Yes.
And if people want to, reach out to you, learn more about your work or this sort of thinking, where should they go?
So if you go to my website, integritylanguages.co.uk, I'm there. Contact me through churchinterpreting.com as well. And on my website is a link to my Twitter feed. I'm going to try and get my Mastodon feed up there as well. You can find me on LinkedIn. It turns out that if you Google my name, there's a little sidebar box that comes up. So I'm easily Googleable. You can use any means you like to contact me, and I will be in touch as soon as I can. Although right now I've got some line editing to do.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, we can and you can give me that information. We can get it in footnotes for this. So if you guys are out there are listening to this on a podcast or on YouTube, look in the footnotes for that information. If you're listening, you're driving. Go ahead. Yeah.
I almost forgot the Church Interpreting podcast is on every podcast service.
Okay. Yeah.
And we're currently on episode. I'm just editing as we're recording this. I have episode 13 to edit. So it comes out roughly monthly, and it's Lauren Albies, our colleague of mine. We do a monthly podcast for churches who are looking at specifically interpreting, but we'll cover some more multilingual stuff as well in the months to come.
That's fantastic. All right, everyone. I hope you guys have found this as interesting and as fascinating and useful as I have. We are the Mission Books Podcast, the official podcast of the William Carey Publishing. Hope you've enjoyed this. Make sure you subscribe. Pass this along to others so we can generate a conversation. Thanks for joining us. Bye.